We also found that Unanga history is unique. The Unanga people received the brunt of harsh European colonization in the 1700s. The Unanga people were enslaved by Europeans in the 1700s and 1800s, and that enslavement was continued by the United States government from 1867 to the 1980s. Only the Unanga people were bombed by the Japanese people by the Japanese military in 1942, the Japanese Imperial Navy, the Japanese Imperial Army. Only the Unanga people were invaded and occupied by the Japanese in 1942 on Attu Island. Only the Unanga people were taken prisoner of war to Japan, where there were many deaths. 881 Unanga people were forcibly relocated by the United States government in the 1940s. The United States government said that was a military necessity. But if you listen to the United States Federal Commission hearings from 1981 here in Anchorage and in Onalaska and St. Paul, APIA hired a brilliant attorney named John Kirtland. And when one of the judges on the panel, the Federal Commission panel, asked Attorney John Kirtland appointed question, why was this done? You'll hear that John Kirtland says the answer is not pretty. And he says it was strictly a decision based upon race. You had to be 1/8 Aleut or more to be forcibly relocated. If you were 1/8 Aleut or less or white, you could stay. So John Kirtland said the claim of military necessity falls upon its face. And only the Unanga people were released from slavery in 1984 without preparations, in which some say there was a spike in homicides. And backing up to the 881 Unanga people, at least about 80 of those people died. John Kirtland uses the term wrongful death. And in the civil world, wrongful death in the criminal world would be classified as a homicide. And so a question that came up, if we're only looking at Unanga homicides back to 1959, do Unanga homicides before 1959 count? And some people don't seem interested in the older homicides. And if you look at a quote from Dr. Gordon Puller, who's a lutic from Kodiak, in the book called Reckoning with the Dead, in which the Smithsonian wanted to display Alaska Natives' remains, particularly skulls collected by Dr. Alice Herdlischka throughout the south coast of Alaska, from Prince William Sound through Kodiak, through the Aleutian Islands. Dr. Gordon Puller noted that there were fundamental differences in worldviews between Westerners and Alaska Natives, different views of time, space, and respect. For Alaska Natives, time is more circular than linear. And there's a quote on pages 18 through 19. Ancestors who died hundreds of years ago are still part of the circle, still members of the group living today. They remain full members of the group. So honoring Unanga homicide victims is part of cultural traditions. And in addition, older Unanga homicides may show long-term patterns. And one long-term pattern we saw was anti-Unanga Aleut hate literature, which is literature specifically created to foment hatred against the Aleut people. And if you carefully read it, it's focused on the hunting of fur seals, which is ironic because this is something that the Europeans and then the Americans forced Unanga people to do. This hatred may result in violence, and it includes films, books, poems, drawings, paintings, and news articles. And it actually began in 1741. If you carefully read the journals of George Wilhelm Steller, and particularly the journal of Lieutenant Sven Waxel from Sweden, it was clear that his men would have, and this is a quote from Sven Waxel's book, his men, there was 80 men on the ship. They were heavily armed. We know how many cannons they had with them. The 80-foot long ship had 80 men on it. And I believe it was 14 cannons, as well as rifles, pistols, knives, and swords. Lieutenant Sven Waxel said that his men would have preferred to have killed the savages. And that hate literature continues up through today. And again, it focuses on Unangax Aleut women and girls, and it focuses on the hunting. The most rage is focused on the hunting and skinning of fur mammals, and this may result in violence against females and males. In reviewing Aleut literature, there's an interesting quote from the Shumagon Islands in 1940 from United States Marshal Alan Peterson that was published in the Alaska Sportsman, October 1940, page 14. And his words are, to me, were really interesting. I know of several cases, particularly murders, where I'm sure I could run down the guilty party and bring him to justice if I had the funds with which to pursue the investigation. But I haven't. And if you read the article, you'll note that Marshal Peterson had plenty of time to arrest people of color and put them in jail for relatively minor crimes. He talks about going a long distance to pursue someone for what today would not be a crime, and questionable whether or not it was crime, but he was proud of being able to arrest that Aleut man and bring him back and put him in the jail in Unga. But he didn't have time to investigate homicides. And then a similar quote from the 1960s, and this is from the doctoral dissertation of Dorothy M. Jones from 1969. Her dissertation is titled A Study of Social and Economic Problems of Onalaska and Aleut Village. And this is a quote from an Alaska state trooper. And he's talking about Onalaska. They could keep me busy full time in the 1960s. I could have made a dozen arrests on my last visit, but there isn't time or money. I know of 5 deaths from questionable causes in the past year. None of these were investigated. And then a quote from Alaska Representative Tiffany Zolkowski, who is Yupik from Bethel. And she said, Alaska Native female homicide victims are made invisible in law enforcement records. We also, with others, looked at the Alaska State Trooper Cold Case webpage, and they had published that from 1961 to 2001, there's 101 cold case homicides, but there was no information besides that number. There was no names, there was no other information. We looked at similar pages from other states, including California, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, and Connecticut. And those other web pages had a lot of information that appeared to be encouraging the public, encouraging citizens to assist by stepping forward and helping solve these homicide cases. They had the names of all the homicide victims in their states. They had photographs of the victims when they were living so that people could see these were real human beings. They had a basic synopsis of what happened, as much information as they could release without jeopardizing the criminal investigations. They even had information about awards that appeared to strongly get out the message that the police or troopers in these other states wanted people to step forward. And we know through other programs, such as the FBI's Most Wanted program or America's Most Wanted, when people take the time to get the information out to the public that we want these cases solved, cold case homicide cases are solved. So we asked the Alaska State Troopers, myself and different people, other people, ask, please give us the name of those 101 cold case homicides. The state troopers refused to release the names. Over 35 people, mostly Alaska Natives, filed Freedom of Information Act requests. The Alaska State Troopers denied those requests. We drafted an Alaska Federation of Natives Resolution 19-22 with AFN asking the Alaska State Troopers to release those names because we believe they're basically public information. Finally, on the weekend before AFN 19, the Alaska State Troopers published 69 names out of those 101 names. And we couldn't help but wonder what happened to those other 32 names. Did the Alaska State Troopers solve 32 cold case homicides over the weekends? And we compared it to what would have happened, heaven forbid, if those 32 cold cases were Alaska law enforcement officers. So it would have been an outcry, an uproar, but there was not a peep. It was a non-event. we assert that those 32 people may include MMIP, MMIP-W, people of low economic or social status, and may be indigenous people. And then to jump to a quick quote that was published at KUCB, and this is a quote from Tatum Robinson in an article titled "We Deserve to Feel Safe, Unanga Activists Speak Up About MMIP-W G2S." And what Tatum said is, "I wouldn't describe it as a pandemic or an epidemic because in my opinion, it's a crisis that is directly linked to genocide. It's a very serious topic, and unfortunately, indigenous people don't have the support from law enforcement that I feel they really deserve." And then another quote from Deb Haaland, the Secretary of Interior, born in Winslow and Arizona, Laguna Pueblo. And what Secretary Haaland said is, "When I see an indigenous woman missing, when I see one of my own sisters, when I see an indigenous woman missing, I see one of my own sisters or one of my aunties or even my own child. I want their voice to be represented here. This is a crisis that has been happening in our country since colonization." And a quote from boarding schools, "The creation of residential schools was part of a broader settler colonial project to exterminate Native American culture and separate them from the land through war and violence." And returning to Notes on the Island of the Onalaska District by Ivan Venemenov, if you carefully read the book, including the introduction of his book, he noted that island group after island group was depopulated, including the islands of the Four Mountains. The Unanga people on Mmip Island were the most resistant to colonization, and Mmip Island was the most heavily populated island. The Europeans sailed there to, I believe it was the north west coast, and they anchored off the village. They went into the Unangamula, into the Brabras. They pretended they were cold, and they systematically killed everybody in the village. And then to make sure everybody was dead, they set the Brabras on fire. Then they sailed to the next village on Unangax Island, did the same thing until they had completely circumnavigated Unangax Island, and the last person on the island was deceased. They did allow a few boys and girls to survive, and they kept them as slaves. And then jumping a little further back in time to Attu Island, in the geographical place names, the events that unfolded there in 1745 are captured. Names like Murder Point, Massacre Beach, Massacre Valley East, Massacre Valley West, as well as Krasnoye Point. And Krasnoye is the Russian word for red. The 1760s were the roughest years for the Unanga people, with the largest slump in population. So the Unanga MMIP map that Marty Murray and I and others created, we created it in Google Maps, and it's available as a link. And it covers a time span from 1741 to 2020. We found numbers of homicides in the Aleutians East and the Aleutians West, as well as outside of the region on the Alaska Peninsula, Southwest Alaska, Anchorage, Southeast Alaska. Most of the wrongful deaths in Southeast Alaska were during World War II as a result of the wrongful termination. The West Coast, Japan, most of the deaths in Japan were when the Unanga people were prisoners of war, and then some in Russia. And so then in terms of potential models that can be utilized in the future, one of them I've mentioned already is Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda T. Smith from New Zealand. What people like Linda T. Smith advocates is a collection of data by indigenous people and the analysis of the data by indigenous people to bring back some of the techniques that existed before colonization, such as self-defense and war training, to speak up and end the silence, and honoring and lifting up homicide victims. And then another model is under the United States Constitution, equal protection of the law. And the 14th Amendment says that we as United States citizens are guaranteed equal protection under the law. So homicides should be investigated the same in Alaska and missing persons should also be investigated the same. And then the Alaska Law Enforcement Code of Ethics that I raised my right hand and swore to comply with and abide by back in 1978 as an Unalaska police officer. I've raised my hand and sworn to the same code of ethics as a police officer with the University of Campus Police, the Anchorage Police Department, the St. Paul Police Department in the Pribilof Islands, the Sandpoint Police Department in the Shumagon Islands, and the King Cove Police on the Alaska Peninsula. And one of the fundamental duties of Alaska police officers, whether they're city police officers or VPSOs or Alaska State Troopers, is to serve all people, to safeguard lives, and to protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, and the peaceful against violence. With no compromise for crime and with relentless prosecution of criminals, I will enforce the law courteously and appropriately without fear or favor, malice or ill will, never employing unnecessary force or violence. Another model is what occurs when Alaska law enforcement are killed in action. We know that there's 100% accountability since 1850. So we know the name of every single Alaska law enforcement officer who has tragically been killed in the line of duty since 1850. There's also 100% transparency and cooperation. So whenever a newspaper reporter or a book author approaches police departments or troopers in Alaska, those agencies cooperate so that they can get the word out, whether it's in a newspaper article or a book. There's 100% celebration. Whenever tragically Alaska law enforcement officer has been killed in the line of duty, there's miles-long police car processions with the lights, the red and blue lights going. There's citizens lined up along the sides of the road, saluting and honoring the law enforcement officer who has tragically been killed. And there's 100% honorable recognition annually. In May, I encourage you to stop by the Alaska State Crime Lab, which is over off of Martin Luther King Drive, kind of kitty corner to the Alaska Native Medical Center, and witness the honoring of Alaska law enforcement. There's a bronze statue. Underneath the bronze statue, there's the names of all the law enforcement officers who've been killed in the line of duty. There's bricks below the memorial, mostly citizens, but also organizations that honor law enforcement officers killed in line of duty. So out of the many officers who have tragically died in the line of duty, and that includes natural deaths on duty or plane accidents or car accidents, it includes one police officer who was accidentally shot and killed by another police officer. We know that there are 42 homicides. Out of those 42 homicides, 41 have been resolved by arrest, or the suspect was killed at the scene by law enforcement, or the suspect committed suicide. So out of 41, we know that 41 of those 42 homicides, 97.6 resolution rate. The only one that is not solved is Anchorage Police Department Chief John Sturgis, who on February 20th, 1921, a little bit over 100 years ago, was found deceased in an alley in downtown Anchorage. His pistol was found beside him. That was at the time declared a homicide, but recently two researchers, Dr. Laura Koenig from the University of Alaska and Rick Godfellow, researched that, and they believe that that was really a suicide. The best evidence they found was a news report before Alaska. John Sturgis lived in Washington State, and then before Washington State, places like Montana. And there was a news report before where John Sturgis had a pistol up against his chest. He was suicidal. There was a history of suicide in his family, and he was going to pull the trigger. At the very last moment, a friend knocked the pistol aside. Instead of John J. Sturgis being shot in the heart, he was shot in the shoulder. But in any case, we know that with law enforcement officers, there's a 97.6% resolution rate. With Unangax MMIP, do we believe that there's that same resolution rate? We don't know because statewide, all Alaska Natives, we don't know the number of Alaska Natives who have been homicide victims over the years, and nor do we know what the resolution rate is. Another model is the FBI LEOKA, FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigations, law enforcement officers killed or assaulted. That data collection began in 1972, some 50, almost 50 years ago. They've been publishing annual bulletins. There's a three-tier approach: data collection, research, training. They have high criteria for what they classify as a LEOKA. Since 1972, the FBI has been analyzing each law enforcement officer killed in the United States. And from that, they do a critical analysis. It's not meant to be disrespectful, but the basic question is, could anything have been done to prevent that law enforcement officer from being killed? For example, and again, this started back in the 1970s, the officer knew the officer was going into a dangerous situation. Was the officer wearing a bullet-resistant vest? The officer was responding to a shots fired call. Was the officer carrying a firearm? Was that firearm loaded? Did the officer know how to use that firearm? And questions like that. And again, those bulletins are published every year. So as I'm getting ready to summarize, I want to emphasize that the Unangax people have endured tough times over the past 300 years and even before that. And the Unangax people are resilient people. When we got knocked down, we get back up and get back into the fight. The resiliency of the Unangax people is astounding. The Unangax people have been affected by colonization, by enslavement, by assimilation, and strongly affected by World War II. It's part of Unangax traditions to be strong and hardy. In summary, to summarize our abstract from the beginning, some people believe Unangax MMIP is not a problem, and that Unangax MMIP is the lowest in Alaska. Some research supports these beliefs, but our research indicates that the Aleut Unangax homicide rate may be the highest over the past 300 years. Our data is conservative. We held our standards very high. We believe that there's more Unangax MMIP than we've been able to identify. Additional research is needed to identify any apparent contributing factors, any short-term patterns, long-term patterns, and additional research needs to be conducted to inform current and future generations. I want to provide you with some resolution. I started this story with a tragedy that occurred when I was age 16. There was a tragedy in a nearby village. A student age 9 was killed. It haunted me for years. I don't want you to be haunted. It took me decades of research to find out the names of the people involved, the victim, the suspect. I have an understanding of what happened. I have found the victim's unmarked grave and honored as best I could, paid respect. I do know that the suspect was identified, arrested, convicted, and served time in jail. I want to conclude by saying, Kagasakun, thank you for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, we'll stop the recording in a few moments. My contact information is here, as well as the SAMHSA helpline, the Veterans Crisis Line, and other contact information. And if you need that, I encourage you to reach out to myself or Stevie. There is a post survey that hopefully Stevie can find and post here. And it's basically the four survey questions that you were asked at the beginning. Please rate your current knowledge of Unangax MMIP, none, beginner, intermediate, advanced. True or false? Unangax Aleut homicide rates are so low that it's really not a problem. True or false? It is a good idea to be aware of the history of the crime where you live. True or false? The Unangax Aleut homicide rate may be lower than other Alaska Natives. And then finally, I have a bibliography of sources that was used for this presentation. The one I'd most strongly encourage you to find and read is Notes on the Island of the Onalaska District by Ivan Venemenov, published in 1984 by University of Alaska Fairbanks and the Limestone Press. So I'm going to stop sharing and ask Stevie, unless Stevie had anything you wanted to add to the recording.
Yeah, Kagasakun to you too. Thank you so much for sharing this today and helping us learn a bit more about the research you've done. I'm sharing a few resources too that are local here to the Seattle area for mental health support, as well as traditional services. Mother Nation is an organization here in Seattle that does great work with healing circles for a whole broad spectrum of things. So they have healing circles for men and women. And then the Seattle Indian Health Board, there's the first link that I shared there for behavioral health services. And then the second one is for traditional health. And you can call that phone number listed there for either one, and they'll help support local individuals or families in setting up traditional health services to support whatever's happening for you or has happened in the past. Yeah, so I think that's it. I will go ahead and stop the recording.
Before you stop, Stevie,
Yes.
thanks. Just a couple real quick announcements. On May 30th, 2022, Memorial Day, we're organizing a ceremony to honor Private George Fox, the only known Unangax Aleut soldier killed in action during World War II or any war since. Private Fox was born in Unga, raised in Onalaska, signed up for the United States Army in 1941. He was a military police officer. He traveled likely to Anchorage and then Seattle and then maybe Texas, maybe New York, where he got on a ship, went over to the European theater. He first served in North Africa and then was on Anzio Beach. And if you know the history of Anzio Beach, it was a brutal war, lots of losses. Just north of Anzio Beach, he was literally fighting the Nazis when a bomb went off close to him. And he was transported to a hospital, but didn't survive the concussion. So his grave has been unmarked for almost 80 years. And thanks to help from United States Senator Dan Sullivan, we were able to order a gravestone to honor him. It's been delivered to Onalaska and is going to be placed on Memorial Day, and encourage you to consider attending. The other announcement is again, this handsome flag designed by Benny Benson, an Alaska Native boy. We've got a couple announcements ready to publish for him. We're waiting for the state of Alaska, the governor, to authorize a press release. And as soon as that press release is given, APIA has another press release. All of these are part of a larger mission in the fight for social and racial justice in terms of, like was said with NAB's North American Boarding School, the fight for truth and justice. So I'll stop talking now and invite you to stop the recording.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, and thank you for anybody who's listening to the playback, as well as those who chose to be here with us today. We really appreciate it. I'll stop the recording and then we will open it for questions if you have any. I know we're at time, but Mike, as long as you're willing to stay, I am as well. Okay.